The 2019 Global Business Services Investment Conference and Awards event took place in Durban, South Africa from the 19th to the 21st of November. This conference, hosted by BPESA, the South African Department of Trade and Industry, and the KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Government, was intended to showcase South Africa's value proposition as a delivery destination for global business services. The program focused on the depth and breadth of service capability, the quality of skills of the youth, and the competitive opportunity for South Africa and continental Africa in the digitally enabled market for global services. Africa is home to 17% of the world's population. By 2050, that number will grow to over 26%. This panel discussion explores the potential for inclusive growth on the African continent, enabled by its human and economic potential. Listen to this panel of experts addressing new markets, new horizons, the potential of Africa.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Martyn Davies. I'm from Deloitte, and I'll be just moderating a bit of a conversation following up from the keynote that Disebo just presented. By way of introduction, last week I was with a former CEO of one of our big banks in South Africa. Not from Standard Bank, I must add. So where's this going, you wonder? And he said to me, he's retired, semi, and he went back to the bank seeking to raise capital. And the bank said to him literally, well, the business plan, you need to build a bit of a track record. We're not going to give you capital. You're too much risk. Now that's for a former CEO. I'm glossing over some finer details here. But a former CEO of one of the largest banks in this country. Picking up what Philip said earlier about rules and arguably institutions stifling innovation and productivity. I think that, in Africa currently, we all know that entrepreneurship is what's required. A World Bank report came out 2 weeks ago stating that for the next 30 years, and you set out the population demographics of countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, DRC, Congo, etc. The numbers are staggering. If demography is destiny, and World Bank accepts this, that for the next 30 years from now, Africa as a continent needs to create 1.7 million jobs every month. A month for 3 decades to accommodate that population growth. And this is deeply concerning. Kate, your world is sort of inequality and the like, and it's clearly the burning issue of our time. And I'll come to you first, perhaps. Is that I looked at, and I'm just setting up the staggering challenges we have in terms of creating formalized incomes, structural employment, economic opportunity, all the nice phrases, inclusive growth we often hear about, but what are the real solutions here? And for me, I looked at a recent study about a few weeks ago, literally, 200 years ago, the wealthiest country was 4 times richer than the poorest country. 4 times. The current measurement is, I compared Switzerland being arguably, by most measures, the wealthiest country in the world per capita to the poorest. The competition for the poorest country is between Burundi and Malawi on a per capita nominal GDP per capita basis. Switzerland is currently 301.5 times wealthier than Burundi. Now, clearly, industrialization, 4IR was mentioned earlier. Industrialization is a force that ultimately should lift all boats, but all boats have not been lifted equally, particularly in this part of the continent. Okay, this is the challenge. We need inclusive growth, we need industrialization. The topic of this conversation is new markets. We need to formalize marketplaces, allowing aspirant entrepreneurs, i.e. young people ideally, to plug in to this thing called economic growth, inclusivity, whatever it may be. That's a big ask. But going forward, of course, we always have this word potential. But Kate, how do we practically, maybe from a private and public sector, start to address the significant challenges that other countries, Disebo, you talk about India and China, have started to progress through? But we in Africa arguably are a generation or 2 behind. What are your opening comments?
Well, it comes back to the theme of this conference, which is that a crucial issue is employment creation. A crucial issue enabling that is investment. One of the specific issues in South Africa that in a way differentiates itself from many of the other African countries is the role of inequality. We inherited huge and diverse forms of structural inequality, and there's quite a wide consensus in the literature that high levels of inequality constrain growth. So we've got to square that circle. Inequality is constraining our growth. Employment is required. Employment is the critical driver of income inequality in South Africa. Employment is the silver bullet we need to take us out of both income inequality and also our levels of poverty.
What argument being is seeing this increase, what's the word, divergence of those incomes. So from a public policy perspective, one could argue, and I've heard the phrase that inequality often results in bad policy. And this becomes an ideological debate because the state feels it needs to do more and more, when in actual fact, maybe the state needs to do less and less and allow the market, so to speak, to operate. Where's the balance?
I'm afraid markets have not shown themselves to be particularly good at addressing inequality. I mean, what the research shows is that economies with high levels of inequality, even where they do grow, tend to reproduce that inequality. So to shift that, you do actually need strategies to do so, and that means new forms of distribution. What we have at the moment is escalating inequality globally because of new forms of value creation. And a lot of those new forms of value creation are because of technology and the way that digital change concentrates wealth. So a big challenge for public policy is to find new forms of sharing that value that don't disrupt value creation, but at the same time don't allow rampant inequality to undermine social cohesion and inclusion.
So last question for you for a second. We hear about the emerging market story largely it's an Asia story. And Disebo, you mentioned that, and Philip earlier resides in Singapore for obvious reasons. And the EM emerging market stats, often you strip out China, it isn't a convergence story, it's a divergence story. The emerging market developing world is diverging from the first, if you take China out of statistics. So China aside, which is quite a unique case, which emerging/developing aspirational countries are getting it right through the lens of addressing inequality?
Well, very few, actually. I mean, I can't name, I can't say that there's one that I would say is getting it right. And it is the big challenge of our time. I mean, I think, inequality is not particularly an issue in Africa. Apart from South Africa, poverty is the big issue for the rest of Africa. So 7 out of 10 of all the poorest people all poor people in the world are in Africa. Africa is one of the places where inequality is not particularly rising. But if you ask me which developing country is the model for addressing rising inequality, I can't answer it.
Disebo mentioned I'm using your keynote for some nuggets of information here. And you spoke about Mozambique. I was in Mozambique in May, just after the Anadarko announcement, and I was with your colleagues in the oil and gas sector of CIB, Cinebank. And it was just rewind slightly, $25 billion, thereabouts, announcement by Anadarko, the single largest capital investment or commodity investment in Africa's economic history ever. Closer to Johannesburg than Durban is. It's significant. But Chris, coming to yourself, is capital traditionally in Africa has always chased resources. Under the Africa Rising narrative, the tone set by The Economist magazine a handful of years ago, capital has chased demographics. Hence, Nigeria becomes attractive to FMCG players because there's lots of Nigerians. No one's ever said to me, with all due respect to the country involved, that our priority market in Africa is the Gambia, or Burundi, or, I don't know, Eswatini, because the demographics don't provide that capital attractiveness. So my question to you is, again, headline question, is if capital has traditionally chased commodities, under the Africa Rising narrative, capital chases demographics. And picking up what Philip was talking about earlier, innovation and tech, when will capital and how will capital start to chase innovation in our continent? Because that ultimately is a developmental story.
I think it's interesting that you use Switzerland as the baseline for a lot of this conversation, a country not that much bigger than the Gambia to start with. But I mean, Switzerland, if you look at that now, its wealth is not based on a fundamental basis of productive infrastructure necessarily. There's a bit of manufacturing in the south and you have some pharmaceutical industries. But
there's 8 million people and a few cows.
Exactly, and what it's really based on is a legacy of that development. And so really I think what you need to be looking for now is where there is the productive potential to be developing that manufacturing, building off a resource base, and then build that into a virtuous cycle of empowering consumers to be able to drive an industry like the business process services sector, for example. And I think if you look at where Africa is, both in terms of demographics and in terms of emerging productive capacity, we are perfectly placed for a lot of that. If you look at the continent broadly, of which, by building a continental free trade agreement, we build a more unified consumer market, you're looking by 2030 at a household consumption of around $2.5 trillion. By 2040, you're looking at an urban population that is larger than China and India. And by 2050, you're looking at a continental population of about 2.5 billion people. And if we have that basis of industrial development and if we have that basis of infrastructure development, building off something like the Mozambique investment, you can then build a virtuous cycle around that. I think some colleagues at Standard Bank like to have there's a figure they like to quote where 4 projects in Mozambique, I think, will consume 2 million eggs, I don't know if it's a week or a month, when they're actually being constructed. And that's a perfect example of how even if we're taking a big project in a resource-based economy, you can then develop a whole range of other types of industries and supporting and building off those industries, particularly if consumers are then being developed by creating opportunities within these major projects.
That's great, but provocatively, we've seen this movie before. It's called Angola. We saw it in Nigeria. We've seen it in most oil-propelled economies in West Africa, where you have these on the surface, and you're right in saying entirely catalytic investments, potentially catalytic projects for broader sort of spread and trickle down ultimately in the broader hinterland economy of the country. But it ain't happened. Clearly, the emerging market story is a governance story, not so.
We have seen this movie before. I think it was called Asia in the 1960s, which had many of the similar types of problems and many of the same basic potential. So I agree with you. Governance is an important factor. Us in the South African government are working very hard to become closer to business, to develop, through some of my colleagues I think who will speak later today, comprehensive investment support mechanisms, incentives and financing opportunities for industries investing in the country, and of course a close relationship between government and business. And I think by developing these types of continental linkages, we help offset a lot of the governance challenges by making sure that some of the key factors that are of concern to business and industry are taken under a continental perspective. So for example, in the services sector, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement includes a protocol on services, which will launch in the middle of next year, and which will allow certain amounts of protections at a continental level that, as a whole, allows our governance to act on a check against each other, to make sure that we have a supportive environment across the continent and we're able to create that type of facilitation through our collaboration across with other continental partners in Africa.
Just staying with you for a last second, is relating this to the overall theme of why we're all here, is arguably the best lead indicator of development of a country, the development trajectory of a country, is the education of young people. If that is true and you accept that, where are we seeing across the continent, and that is underwritten the Asia story ultimately, where across the continent are we seeing states investing properly in decent education for young people?
I mean, I think it is something that many countries are doing to the extent that they have capacity. Of course, I think the most famous examples are Rwanda, Ethiopia, those types of cases. In South Africa, we spend more on education in terms of GDP than many other countries. And of course, we still have a long way to go in that journey. But there is, I think, has been experienced with some of the young entrepreneurs here, a great emerging base of talent and skills that we can tap into. So I think a lot of it is about making sure that we expand those educational systems to a more broad-based, inclusive model, but at the same time making sure that we have centers of excellence that can allow a base of skills and technology development that can really drive a lot of these industries in the short term. And once we get that growth going and create those opportunities, then it naturally creates a virtuous cycle to try and drive educational outcomes forward as you have greater investment as industry grows along with that. So it is, I think, one of the fundamental challenges, as you say, but one at least as we develop momentum, I think there's greater potential for us to really grapple with in a more meaningful way.
Great, thank you. Disebo, you talk about, well, banking. You guys are probably arguably one of the most pervasive banks. You mentioned 20 countries, I think it was, across the continent now, sub-Saharan Africa. You are in the forefront of professional services provision, financial services in sub-Sahara. Chris mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. How is Standard Bank thinking around, I think often there's a disconnect between, we see trade policy, we hear about trade policy, but particularly in the countries where GDP is entirely dependent on trade, countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, economies like Hong Kong, even China, there's an obsession with trade policy through a corporate lens. I think there's often a disconnect in our town here in SA for whatever reason. But could you just talk to Standard Bank's thinking about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the services component of that, and how you guys are positioning, thinking, working through this very nascent but high promise, broad brush free trade agreement that we are seeking to implement across Africa?
For us, I think if you look at the free trade agreement and the countries where we operate, which is the 20 countries in the continent, we look at it as to how it actually supports and starts enabling the trade between our country, the countries that we operate in, into the global sphere, as well as within the continent itself. What you find now is a lot of, if I take, for instance, the cocoa in Ghana, it is traded, it is shipped outside of Ghana as almost a raw material to be made into chocolate in Switzerland and attract premium back.
It's called Lindt or Toblerone, I guess.
It's called Lindt, and we all love it.
We're big fans, yeah.
But if you are in Ghana and you're eating the Ghanaian-made chocolate, the obsession with quality, those are the kind of things that we want to facilitate that Ghana can export into the African markets that are bordering Ghana itself and can actually flow. They will make more margins in terms of how much they can actually sell. They can actually even do a distribution network of that cocoa, establish factories that will indeed make the cocoa, the chocolate and hot chocolate that is so beautiful from the very same good quality cocoa. So it's supporting those clients to experience and expand their business into the various markets. And this agreement enables that flow of goods and services into the various markets which are closer in location, can actually utilize the common currencies that we can facilitate instead of everything being based in US dollars and acquiring all the trade exchange fees and all of that. So it's those kind of things that we see this, the trade agreement offering us and our clients an opportunity to expand and increase the trade, which I talked about, which is currently sitting so low in the intertrade between countries in the continent.
So, but look, you mentioned earlier the sort of, how can I say, the new actors, if you will, vis-a-vis Africa in terms of trade. You mentioned Asia, countries like China, of course, which has been incredibly enabling, but also disruptive, arguably, for private sector activity in Africa and existing companies, etc. India, Turkey's there, amongst many others. just talk to Standard Bank is a bank which was very much emerging markets focused, but has largely come back to Africa. How are you still thinking about servicing from a banking perspective, be it corporate, be it trade finance type work, these new corridors of commerce, new corridors of trade that that are prevalent vis-a-vis Africa and the new trading routes, if you will, with these new engaging markets? And I tee it up by saying even Durban. I mean, Durban here, from a KZN perspective, it's more of a rise of the Indian Ocean rim, but it's a look east policy, arguably from a KZN perspective, into near Asia, South Asia, the Far East. How is the bank positioning and thinking about this broader macro mega trend of the shifting direction of trade in our continent toward the east?
You will know that we have got a strong relationship in that ICBC owns 20% of the bank.
Yeah.
That position also puts us very close to facilitating the trade flows between China and the continent. It also puts us very close, and we actually are at the center of ensuring that we bring in the capital. We do bonds in renminbi. We do facilitation in terms of exchange between renminbi and dollars, or even the African currencies. So our role not only covers the trade in terms of letters of credit and guarantees that all the traders would need when they import or export into these markets, but also making sure that we can cover the foreign exchange transactions that need to happen. So our closeness to the East Asia market, and our closeness to the African continent markets gives us an opportunity and a privilege to work very closely with our clients, understanding where their growth is. We're seeing even facilitation of South African companies that are looking to get into the markets in the rest of the continent. We are at the forefront of facilitating that growth path, giving thought leadership in terms of the kind of markets they could actually invest in, enabling them to have banking facilities in those markets, banking their employees in those markets, and even just making sure that they get the documentation as quick as they can, because we are present, we understand the nuances of the country that we operate in. So we are at the center already. There is more expansion that we will see going forward as more and more goods and services, and in particular this industry that we're exploring, that is basically looking at facilitation of trade of a different kind, utilizing the services in terms of operations as we see it here in this conference. We will then be playing different roles. I talked about the real estate development in setting up the facilities that takes that, the infrastructure in terms of the technology that would be required, financing of that. But more importantly, as the trade happens, enabling those trade flows to actually happen smoothly across the various regions. And it's not only Asia, it's USA, it's Europe, and North America in total.
Chris, coming back to you, and I'll work my way back to Kate, Disebo talks about the sorry state, arguably, of intra-regional trade. The figures vary from 14, 15, 16, whatever % of total trade is intra-regional. There is one region worse than us, and that's the Middle East. Clearly, Kuwait is not exporting oil to Iraq or vice versa. So, question to you, Chris, it's more of a sort of an academic issue. Which comes first, a free trade agreement or the deeper value chain? Because commodity countries don't typically trade with each other. You need to have deeper manufacturing sectors which spur that demand for that particular commodity. So are we, a provocative question, are we putting too much emphasis on a liberalized free trade agreement as a potential silver bullet for sort of increased commerce and trading success? Or was that naive? Should we look more towards the longer term and lay the necessary foundations for a deeper manufacturing economy, and trade will just happen naturally?
I think to answer your first question, absolutely. You need to have the core economic compatibility. So you need to have those value chains being developed. You need to have that industrial capacity being developed. But to answer your second question, are we putting too much emphasis on the agreement? I would say no. And the reason for that is because they are enablers of each other effectively. Once you have that agreement in place, you then have a framework to more effectively put in place and develop those types of value chains with other countries. And that is particularly important, I think, firstly, because the AFCFTA is not limited simply to a goods agreement. It's not simply a free trade agreement. It's a mechanism by which we can have concentrated, coordinated cooperation around industrial policy, around the development of regional value chains that are globally competitive, and around the development of a regional service sector, for example. And particularly, I think, when you start looking at the demographics, as you have larger consumer markets, you naturally have a diversification of your economy as your economy adapts to supply those consumer markets. So we're expecting over the next coming decades a greater diversification, both by policy driving these types of core enablers, by consumers driving the types of products that they need and diversifying the industries around them, and then as a final stage through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, then developing those networks across borders, building the types of regional value chains that we've seen in East Asia, for example, and that then allow us to look more towards the rest of the global economy and start moving more aggressively into some of those markets. So you're right, there's a sequencing challenge, but I think the real approach here is to make sure that you have those enabling frameworks in place and then do the hard work of developing a lot of that complementarity, and a lot of that is in place and it is underway.
Excellent. KK, just building on that exactly, is then a manufacturing economy, think arguably Asia to an extent, I'm being very sort of superficial and generic here, is a manufacturing economy a more inclusive economy? Because clearly you have structural employment, 12 checks a year, formal job, maybe 13 if you're lucky, versus working in a sort of, being a farming, agricultural focused individual. You may be working, getting 1-2 checks a year when harvest time comes or the rains come. It's very sort of climatic dependent. So the question is to you, is that from an equality perspective, is our challenge really, if we solve the industrialization story, inequality will just naturally subside? And the challenge in South Africa is we've hemorrhaged roughly 10-12% of manufacturing value added to GDP in our country in the last generation. What's your view?
I think these are choices in the sense that manufacturing jobs can also be exploitative. They can also be non-inclusive in that sense. Getting a regular poverty wage is not a great thing for inclusivity.
Can I stop here for a second? I'm just very curious. What is a, you say poverty wage. What's a poverty wage in SA? Give me a figure.
Well, I mean, I think the minimum wage was set at 3,500 a month, precisely because calculations were made that people could not get the required calorie intake, could not cover their basic needs on anything under that. I mean, there are different poverty lines. So, there's a huge academic debate over where exactly the poverty line sits. But I think that there is such a thing as working poverty that is a recognized phenomenon. And it can apply across any sector. So what I'm really trying to say is, I don't think it's helpful to say manufacturing is more inclusive. It depends a lot on the terms on which that happens. And I think similarly with the new kinds of jobs that are emerging in the gig economy, there again you're seeing new kinds of precariousness of work, and yet at the same time many of those jobs can offer really good terms and conditions of service. So I don't really think it's an issue of the sector. I think it's about the policy choices and the choices that owners and enterprises make, and the power struggles that evolve around those.
Do you think from the future work in manufacturing jobs are very difficult to create, arguably, particularly for better for worse, highly regulated environments. And again, in a globalized world, this becomes more and more difficult. And globalization is ultimately about arbitrage. Can a product be manufactured cheap in a different geography? And the difference in the cost of manufacturing Chris's pair of shoes, whether in South Africa or in China or in Vietnam, is not significantly high. I would argue that the future of employment, this gig economy you mentioned, lies in services. Because, again, from an arbitrage perspective, the price differentials in service delivery are significantly greater. The creation and delivery of those services is significantly greater than the manufacturing or price of a product. So in light of what Philip was talking earlier about the sort of rise of tech and enablement, etc., are we not missing a beat here? I mean, Chris, from a public policy, from a DTI perspective, we all talk about employment and manufacturing and all, so maybe we're a bit lagging here in our mindset. Maybe we should be a little bit more Singaporean and say, well, we need to best somehow plug into global services provision, because that's where the future of jobs really lies. What's your view to that? Should we just scrap our industrial strategy?
Probably not. But I think you probably need to have both, right? The thing is that services and manufacturing exist in a symbiosis. If we got rid of the manufacturing sector or the mining sector today, all of the services companies, many that are here today, wouldn't necessarily have clients to serve. Those are the core drivers of a lot of the services economy, just in the way that the modern manufacturing relies on advanced services to empower a lot of that core complex manufacturing processes. So it needs to exist together. It needs to be thinking about the way in which these various industries are linked, and the way in which we target our sectoral focus is on where those interconnections lie, rather than in abstract about whether it's manufacturing or whether it's services. It's about where you get that value addition by building connections across the economy and making sure that where you're investing creates benefits not just in that sector itself, but by empowering other sectors, by empowering other people who can then eventually become consumers and build that virtuous cycle. So I agree with you in asking these questions about we need to think about where we can have the most value, but I think the answer to where that lies is in a range of different sectors, both in manufacturing and in things like global business services, for example, which is where a lot of our focus lies at the moment.
So is there any truth to the rumor that the DTI is going to be rebranded to the Department of Trade and Industry and Services?
I'll take it up the chain to the man in the video and see what he says.
I think DTIS has a good ring to it. You heard it here first. By way of, I'm not sure if we have any question time, but maybe we should just, I think not. But we'll keep it tight. To conclude, and so I'm going to start with you and work way down. Maybe again, this conversation about Africa, and the challenge I have is, it's such a heterogeneous place, highly fragmented, not a single marketplace. It's like saying Asia and comparing Mongolia to Singapore. There's just no comparison. So it's very difficult to have these broad brush conversations around what is a very fragmented, multiple economic sort of market region that is called Africa. But in light of that, just why Africa matters, well, is it just purely, again, rhetorical questions, is it a demographic story? Is it a commodity story? Is it a future innovation story? Clearly the challenges are immense. What's your prognosis for the medium term? Give us 5 years. Seba, what's your concluding remarks in 30 seconds or so?
Well, yes, some of it will be demographic. Some of it will be the scale of the market. Diverse as it is, that's where the opportunity actually lies, because then you have a variety of goods and services that you actually can source from within the continent, that get consumed within the continent, and that actually needed outside of the continent and globally. And therefore becomes the better base from which to market those goods and services to the various global destinations where they are destined to. And that is an opportunity for bigger investments. That's where the growth is. If you look at the GDP growth figures that I talked about, nowhere else globally do they exist except on this continent. And if that is not opportunity enough for any investor to look at the returns, I don't know what else would be.
And Matt for Standard Bank, underpinning your strategy. Christopher, from DTIS.
Not yet branded. I think you mentioned resources, you mentioned demographics. What is the driver? I would say yes, is my answer. Pretty much all of them. The demographics are absolutely in place. The resources are very well established and being further developed and still have a lot of untapped potential. Manufacturing is already competitive globally in many countries, including in South Africa, and is emerging in many newer, less developed countries. And of course, then we have a baseline of a regional free trade agreement that is going to facilitate further integration and the development of these more efficient regional value chains. I think we spoke a lot about trust this morning. My urging would be to trust in the fundamentals. What really defines economic growth in the long run is not necessarily the short-term challenges or the stop-start nature of development, but where those fundamentals exist. And if you look at the maths of it all, if you look at the basic path of the last couple of years and the last few decades and where we think we're going to go in the coming decades, it is absolutely true that the fundamentals of development are sitting in Africa, and I think that's where the potential lies for investors.
Kate.
I think the other speakers have most eloquently presented the case for investment. What I would simply add is the importance of the social impact dimension, is that there's a huge opportunity to make a significant difference to poverty in Africa and to, in particular, unemployment and inequality in South Africa.
Okay, thank you all. Just by way of very brief conclusion, is the oldest country in the world median age is Japan, 48.3 years. You can Google it. Germany, I think, is 47.5. The median age of many countries in our part of the world often are high teens. And that talks to the potential, and if demography is destiny, then so be it. That's where the, quote, banking term, yield will come from. The challenges are immense. Of course, you need to have functional, effective states underpinned by pragmatic policy, ultimately resulting in inclusive growth, i.e. trickle down. The challenges, I think, often in commodity-driven economies, there's no trickle down because the rents from commodities, especially oil, are captured by politically connected elites, and that's ultimately the challenge. Therefore, a diversified economy is inherently, arguably, a more inclusive economy. Then we can look at the details and start to figure out and make it even more embedded middle class, more diffused wealth, and that ultimately talks to sustainability going forward. I think for us, just picking up on my point of arbitrage and services, think about your personal lives and the things you buy and the things you purchase or your costs. In the last decade or so, arguably more, because of the China price, product prices have come down significantly. Consumer electronics, think about the TVs you buy, the consumer electronics. You buy your TV in 2017, 2018 is half price. On the product side, our worlds are very deflationary. Stuff becomes cheaper. On the services side, your lives are becoming significantly more expensive. Think kids' education, think healthcare, think private insurance. Conclusion being, tradables across borders become cheaper. Non-tradables are inflationary. The real opportunity for every emerging country, I would argue, is how to, be it underpinned by free trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, but ultimately, Kate, smart policy, is how countries, human capital ultimately, citizens, population, can take advantage of that arbitrage and provide these services which have become incredibly inflationary, especially in first world markets, in the last decade or so, and trade those across borders. And that is enabled by tech, and that takes us right back to the beginning. Just some thoughts on the future of development, jobs, technology, and fusing it all together. On behalf of the excellent contributions, Kate, Chris, Disebo, thank you very much. Much appreciated. On behalf of Deloitte, thanks for having us here. Have a good conference, and thanks for your presence. Thanks, everybody.